In the name of Allah Almighty, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum class. It is lecture number 15 of History of English Literature 1. And the topic that we have to cover today is novelists and prose writers of late Victorian period. Lecture outline. First I will discuss introduction, then novelists of the later Victorian period, prose writers of the later Victorian period, Newman and the Oxford movement, and at the end there is conclusion. Alright, starting with introduction. The novel in the later Victorian period took a new trend, and the novels written during this period may be called modern novels. George Eliot was the first to write novels in modern style. Other important novelists of this period were Meredith and Hardy. So the novel that were written during this later period, they had a resemblance with the resemblance in the sense of themes and the subjects of the novels of modern times, because at that time the later Victorian period was going on, and it was almost the end of the Victorian and then the start of the modern. So it means, as it happened that when Romantic age was ending, so there was an influence of the Romantics on the Victorians as well. Similarly, when 18th century literature, the new classical literature was ending, or the time was ending, it had an influence on the Romantics, as William Blake had also used few of the themes and the style of the 18th century poets. Similarly, so what happened? So novelists of the later Victorian period, they also had this trend, and their novels which were written during this modern period, they had a style, they had a theme and subjects of the way modern novels were written, because at that time there was the technological development and the advancement in the science that was at the peak. Because of it, there was deterioration in the family life, in the society, in movement from the rural to the urban class. So as a result, we find such themes in those novels. Okay, so George Eliot is the one of the famous, you can say, the novelist of this era, of this age. Then there are George Meredith and Thomas Hardy. Okay, George Eliot lived in a much larger world of ideas. These ideas conditioned her views of fiction. Yes, George Eliot, she was a woman, and she adopted this pen name of men because at that time it was not considered appropriate for women to write novels, poetry, or come in the limelight. So that is why she has used her pen name, that was George Eliot, in order to present herself in the society. So these ideas conditioned her views of fiction, determined the shape of her novels and the imagery of her prose. So what happened? These ideas, they condition the way, because there was a lot of ideas coming into minds of the writers and the poets, because of the different or the multiple developments at that time. So these ideas condition her views of fiction. The way fiction is written, it conditioned her views. It determined the shape of her novels, that how novels should be written, and imagery of her prose, the way she has written the prose, it also provided the imagery for her. Meredith, who was partially educated in Germany and was influenced by French writers, developed a highly critical view of England and its literature. So George Meredith, he was educated in Germany and also influenced by the French writers. He developed a highly critical view of England and its literature. So novelists of the later Victorian period are George Eliot, George Meredith, and Thomas Hardy. George Eliot, lifespan 1819 to 1880. The real name of George Eliot was Mary Ann Evans. As I told you that it was her pen name, she was a woman, and her real name was Mary Ann Evans, and this was her pen name which she adopted. For a long time, her writings were exclusively critical and philosophic in character, and it was when she was 38 that her first work of fiction, Scenes of Clerical Life, appeared. So her writings for a long time were critical and philosophical in character, which means she wrote on such subjects which were critical, which had a philosophical impact, and it was after much time that she started writing on different subjects and the themes on the topics of the society. Okay, so it was only when she was 38 that her first work of fiction, Scenes of Clerical Life, it appeared in 1857. So this was before that she wrote such works novels, prose, stories, you can say, which were critical and philosophical, had a real appeal. Okay, the appeal which were non-fiction. Okay, so when she started fiction, it was in the scenes of clerical life. Her works include Adam Bede in 1857, Tamil on the Floss 1860, Silas Marner 1861, Romala 1863, Middlemarch 1871 to 72. They are the important or the major works written by George Eliot. Okay, next novelist that we have in the list of later Victorian novelists is George Meredith. Lifespan 1829 to 1909, and George Meredith wrote different novels, and he was also a name in the field of fiction, but he was not as much popular as was George Eliot and other novelists. Another great figure, not only in fiction but in the general field of literature during the later Victorian period, was George Meredith. He did not follow any established tradition, nor did he found a school, which means that he did not follow any other novelist or the prose writer, but nor did he found a school, which means that he did not found anything. He did not put a foundation of the new trend in the novel. Rather, he just took few things from the past and also added few from his own. Okay, so his works include The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, Van Harrington, Sandra Belloni, Harry Richmond. So these are the names of his works. Yes. Next we have Thomas Hardy. Hardy was born in 1840 and died in 1928. So it means that he was the one who not only lived in the time of the Victorian period, but also he had his impact, and he also worked in the era which was later came to be known as modern age. The greatest novelist of the later Victorian period was Thomas Hardy. Like Meredith, he was at heart a poet and expressed himself also in verse. So he was not only a poet but also expressed himself in a verse, which means he also wrote novel and prose. But unlike Meredith, whose attitude to life is optimistic and who has written comedies, Hardy's attitude to life is rather pessimistic and he has written tragedies. But if we compare both novelists, so we came to know that Meredith's attitude to the life was optimistic. Optimism is something which relates to thinking positively about the life, that he was optimistic, which means that he had a better view of the life. He thinks everything in a very light way. And who has written comedies? Hardy's attitude to life is rather pessimistic, while on the other hand he considers things negatively, or on the other sense you can say that he takes things as they happen and he blames other person for it. Like he says that whatever happens to you, it happens because of the mistakes of the person. Like we can commit mistakes, so we are responsible for it. All right. So that is why he has written tragedies in which he had proved that characters or the protagonist's downfall is because of his own actions, and it is not something related to the although it is related to the god in some or the other way, but mainly it is because of the character's own downfall or the character's own mistakes which bring his downfall. All right. So his works include The Woodlanders, The Return of the Native. In The Return of the Native, yes, it is depicted that the characters' actions are guided by their own thoughts, their own emotions. As a result, they face their downfall, and the human or the nature which depicts the god also does not like to favor the persons. Rather, God also plans to give them punishment. So that is what is the negative thought in this novel. Next is Far from the Madding Crowd and Mayor of the Castro Page. Similarly, the character's downfall and characters the problems are faced by the different persons. They are because of the sometimes because of God and sometimes because of their own actions. That is the pessimistic view of the life which has been depicted by Hardy in his different novels. Test of the D'Urbervilles. Then there is Jude the Obscure. So they are the important works of Thomas Hardy. Some other novelists of that time are Robert Louis Stevenson. Although they were the novelists at that time who were writing different novels, but they were not as famous as were the Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, and George Meredith. All right. So the Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island and New Arabian Nights, Kidnapped, The Black Arrow, and which contain romances and mystery stories. And he also wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And in this novel, he said that he departed from his usual manner to write a modern allegory of the good and evil in the human personality, in that he had shown the true perspective, the two sides of the human nature, that is good and the evil, which is depicted in this novel. Next, we have George Gissing. Okay, so George Gissing was also there, and he wrote different works like Worker in the Dawn, The Unclassed, Doms, The Emancipated, New Grub Street, Born in Exile. So these novels were written by George Gissing. Okay, next we have prose writers of the later Victorian period. I have already explained the prose. What is that? What is prose? It is a straightforward writing. It is a kind of essay in which writer talks about one single topic and completes the thought. So that is what is prose, right? Prose. And the prose writers of the later Victorian period. In the later Victorian period, there were two great prose writers, Newman and Pater. Newman was the central figure of the Oxford movement, while Pater was an aesthete who inspired the leaders of the aesthetic movement in England poetry. Okay, so if we talk about these two, Newman and Pater, he was the center figure of Oxford movement. Oxford movement, we will also cover it in the next slide, that what Oxford movement is, and he was the central figure. Next, we talk about the Walter Pater, and Pater was basically an aesthete. An aesthete is a person who does not believe in the God and he does not have any religion. And he also inspired the leaders of the aesthetic movement in England in the poetry of the England. So he also inspired other people as well. Yes. Next we have Newman and the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was an attempt to recover a lost tradition. So the protagonist of the Oxford movement tried to show that the Middle Ages had qualities and capacities which the moderns lacked. Oxford movement basically was an attempt to recover the tradition that was lost. For example, in the Middle Ages, the themes, the subjects, and the topics of the poetry, like the religion, the state, the politics, and the rationalism of that time, which was presented and translated by different poets. So this was basically the aim of this Oxford movement. They wanted to bring back such themes and such subjects. The protagonists of the Oxford movement tried to show that the Middle Ages had the qualities and capacities which the moderns lack. Why they say that? Because from their point of view, the Oxford movement was an attempt to make the rationalistic attack by emphasizing the importance of tradition, authority, and the emotional element in the religion. And the germ of the Oxford movement is to be found in 1822 in Wordsworth's Ecclesiastical Sketches. Okay, so Wordsworth has also worked on it, and his work also praises the works of the Middle Ages, that it is also worthy of imitation. Okay, from point of view, it was an attempt to meet the rationalistic attack by emphasizing the importance of tradition, authority, and the emotional element in religion. Yes, its germ was found in Ecclesiastic Sketches. Next, we have John Henry Newman. And who was he? John Henry Newman. He joined later, became soon the moving force in the movement. Newman, the most important personality of the movement, is also its most conscious writer. He dreamed of a free and powerful church and aspired to return to the spirit of the Middle Ages. Okay, so this is what he wanted, that he wanted to have the church. He said that there was, free and powerful, there should be a free and powerful church as was happened or as used to happen in the Middle Ages. Alright, So church had an authority, and even the kings and the queens were also submissive to the church. Whatever they have to do, they had to get permission from the church first. So this is what he wanted, John Henry Newman. So he wanted the church to have that much power. So he was the person who later joined this movement, and his works include Apologia. He wrote that work. Newman was a great writer of prose and verse. In Apologia, he set for the reasons for his conversion. This fascinating book is the great prose document of the Oxford movement, and it is eminently and emphatically literature. From first to last, it is written in pure, flawless, and refined prose. His style is a clear reflection of his character. Refinement, severity, strength, sweetness, all of these words are truly descriptive of the style as well as of the character of Newman. So another special characteristics of Newman's style is its wide range. He can express himself in a manner he pleases, and that most naturally and most unconsciously. In his writing, sarcasm, biting irony, glowing passion are seen side by side, and he can change from one to the other without effort. His art of prose writing is therefore most natural and perfectly concealed. Other prose writer of this age is Walter Pater, 1839 to 1894, and Pater belongs to the group of great Victorian critics like Ruskin and Arnold. He belongs to that group. Like whatever they have written means they were writing things at the same time. Though he followed a new line of criticism and was more akin. Akin means equal, and it was equal to Ruskin than to Arnold. He was also the leader of the aesthetics and decadent of the later part of the 19th century. Okay, if we compare him with Ruskin and Arnold, so he is more equal to the Ruskin than to Arnold, and he was the leader of the aesthetics or decadent of the later part of the 19th century. And what was decadent or aesthetic movement? I have already explained, so I'll repeat again that it is basically a movement in which the poets laid greater emphasis on the idea of the art for art's sake. And in this movement, there was a tendency among the literary artists to lay greater emphasis on this area, that they wanted to write the poetry and the prose, particularly the prose, for the art's sake, for the sake of the pleasure. It was not for, for the art for life's sake. They were obviously influenced by Walter Pater and the French authors like Baudelaire and Verlaine, who tried to break with conventional values. So he also had an impact of the French writers as well. Next, we have the works of Walter Pater. He wrote History of Renaissance in 1873, Greek Studies, and Marius the Epicurean. Okay, like Ruskin, Pater was an Epicurean. Epicurean means about someone who is a worshipper of beauty, but he did not attach much importance to the moral and ethical side of it as Ruskin did. He was curiously interested in the phases of history, and chiefly in those like the Renaissance and the beginnings of Christianity, in which men's minds were driven by a powerful eagerness or stirred by a proud conflicts. He thus tried to trace the history of man through picturesque surroundings as his life developed, and he laid great stress on artistic value from these studies. So, this is what is depicted in Studies in the History of the Renaissance. So, as a critic, Pater stands eminent. His method is that Impressionism, which Hazlitt and Lamb had brilliantly illustrated. He was not only a prose writer, but he was also a critic as well. Okay, so I would like to conclude this lecture by saying that, like the second generation of fiction writers in the Victorian age, the second generation of prose writers was more conscious of the art of prose writing than their predecessors. Similarly, if we talk about the prose novelists of the later Victorian age, so novelists were also, they had a tendency toward the modern age. Whatever they wrote, they had a similarity with modern age or the subjects and the themes of the modern era. Similarly, the second generation of prose writers, they were more conscious of the art of prose writing than their predecessor, that they had written prose in a much better way. Okay, they were rather indifferent to the theological, political, and economic issues of their time. Indifferent means they did not consider these issues, and they did not write upon those issues. Unlike their predecessor, they made writing the sole business of their life. Art for art's sake was their slogan. So whatever, as I said earlier, that they also had brought the Oxford movement and also the Decadent or as the aesthetic movement. Both the movements were carried out in order to promote literature for art's sake, like writing literature for the sake of pleasure, and this literature was not for the sake of guidance or teaching.